Here's the state of play in Florida right now. Republican politicians of the state just celebrated the grand opening of an immigrant prison camp in the middle of the Everglades, one that was built using abused emergency powers in which the governor of Florida seized land that didn't belong to him and then rushed tens of millions of dollars of payments out the door to vendors and no bid contracts. At the very same day, that same governor also vetoed a bill that would have dramatically strengthened the state's anti corruption laws and prevented people like the governor from interfering in elections and squeezing lobbyists for campaign contributions. We're going to tell you more about both of those stories in just a second. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses that wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about two big stories in Florida politics. And these are stories that are, like, on the surface unrelated to each other, but are actually very much related in a couple of ways. One is that one of these was used in an attempt to distract from the other. But two, and more importantly in my mind, they both kind of illustrate the way just how much power Florida has allowed to become concentrated in its governor in a way, and how this sort of concentration of power in the governor is now leading to essentially legalized abuses of power in this state in a way that's getting increasingly alarming as the months go by. And so the first and probably the most obvious is we should talk about is the immigrant prison camp that Florida has built in the past 2 weeks in the middle of the Florida Everglades at an airstrip in the Everglades. This is the place that a number of Republican politicians are gleefully branding as Alligator Alcatraz. And when I say gleefully, I mean selling merch off of this stuff. They went to a grand opening where people were posing for pictures in front of cameras as if they were attending a red carpet movie premiere in Hollywood. It was pretty wild to see when again what you're talking about here is a bunch of cages that have been built under tents in the middle of a swamp in Florida, where actual living human beings are going to be held in the middle of August on ground that is in the middle of hurricane season, on ground that's a foot above sea level, at a time when we've got across the country masked ICE agents raiding Home Depots and smashing people's windows and pulling people into detention in ways that we know have, like, people have been mistakenly deported already. People have been mistakenly detained. We're even creating illegal immigrants by revoking humanitarian protections and legal statuses for people from Venezuela and Cuba and Haiti. And all of this stuff is happening, and now we're going to start parking some of these people in a prison camp in the middle of a swamp in Florida. But hey, at least it looks, the Alligator Alcatraz merch looks cool. But I think the reason I want to talk about this is I want to make sure people understand sort of how this has happened, what has enabled this, because it is pretty wild to think that some of this idea first, like, emerged in public, like I said, 2 weeks ago, and when you think through what has happened to sort of build this camp, the state literally commandeered land it did not own from local taxpayers in Miami-Dade County and Collier County. And commandeered, by the way, is not my word. That is the state's lawyers for the state. That's their own words. They've used this in court filings in a court challenge trying to stop this thing. Anyway, they seized land for this prison. They've already rushed out the door more than $70 million in just the past 2 weeks to a handful of vendors that have been identified working on this project. And they've done so without bidding much, if at all, of these contracts. Most of this is being done in no bid work, just being rushed out the door to existing contractors. And they're doing this. You might ask yourself how they're able to do this. How could you possibly be bypassing procurement rules? How could you be seizing land that doesn't belong to you? And they're doing it because the governor has invoked a number of emergency powers under a state of emergency that has now been in effect in Florida for nearly 3 years. The history here is that in January 2023, Ron DeSantis, this is as he was gearing up to run for president, so he's looking for every possible way to get himself into national news cycles, particularly on issues that he thought would play well in a Republican primary against Donald Trump when he was going to run against Donald Trump. And so he declared a state of emergency in Florida based on illegal immigration. And again, that was January 2023. And the reason that's important is when a governor declares a state of emergency, they get access to a whole bunch of extra legal powers. And so, for instance, you get the ability to waive like advertising and bidding requirements and the ability to award no bid contracts. You get the ability to suspend certain state laws. You get the ability to seize land, all of this stuff. And when you think about it, it makes sense in like the typical sort of a idea people think of when you're thinking of a state of emergency. A hurricane is coming, and suddenly you need to like mobilize a bunch of resources really quickly. You need to position a bunch of assets in place so you can go in as soon as the hurricane passes. And once it does pass, you need to get in there quickly so you can clear debris, rebuild roads, rebuild power lines, get erect temporary shelter for people. People who've been displaced by the storm, all of that stuff. And you want that stuff to happen as fast as possible. And you don't want the response to be slowed by the kind of existing like rules and procedures and red tape that exists to, make sure that taxpayers are getting the best deal for their dollar, that there's not cronyism in contracts and that sort of thing. And so that's what you normally think of a state of emergency. And the thing about a state of emergency is it is supposed to be temporary. This is supposed to be a very short term thing where the governor gets his power. Each state of emergency is only supposed to last 60 days. The governor has to renew it at that point. And so the governor declared this state of emergency about illegal immigration in January 2023. And then he renewed it, and then he renewed it again, and then he renewed it again. And he's renewed this state of emergency 15 times since then. We are now 2.5 years into this state of emergency that was initially declared, by the way, because claiming that the policies of the Biden administration had created this state of these emergency conditions that the governor needed all these excess powers. And so, we're 6 months into the Trump administration now, just about. And yet here we are still continuing to extend the state of emergency and allow the governor access to these powers. And so, another one of the powers he has in a state of emergency is the power to, quote, make provision for the availability and use of temporary emergency housing. And that, believe it or not, is one of the main things he's relying on building this Everglades immigrant prison camp, right? The governor is supposed to have power so that he can make sure that there are trailers put into place for people whose homes are destroyed in a hurricane, and he's using that instead to disappear immigrants into a swamp. I mean, this is wild stuff. This is how he's able to, I'll throw a link to some of these stories in there, but like Bloomberg had a story identifying some of the vendors working on this project. And then I think Rolling Stone went looking through some of the campaign contributions. And again, all this is money being rushed out the door with no bidding, with no public solicitation, that sort of thing. And again, all because it's being done under this emergency powers. Again, he wouldn't even have access to this land if it weren't for the fact that we were in a nearly 3 year long state of emergency now. And the thing about this is the Florida legislature has absolutely enabled this. And it's done so in a couple of ways. And the first is they have, during Ron DeSantis' time, they have dramatically expanded his state of emergency power. And I'm thinking of this in one particular way. So back in 2021, this was kind of post-COVID, or I guess 2021, you'd still think still in COVID kind of stuff. The legislature essentially created this giant pot of money for the governor to spend as he wished on emergency response. And they have put, the last I checked, $2 billion into this money. This is money the governor can do whatever he wants with in a state of emergency, as long as it's tangentially related, ostensibly related to responding to this emergency. And when they did it at the time, it was all, again, cast around responding to hurricanes and natural disasters. In the same way when they created the Florida State Guard, this personal militia that Ron DeSantis controls, or this state militia that Ron DeSantis controls, they always pitch it around responding to natural disasters, which resonates in Florida, a state that is just now like basically annually battered by hurricanes that are getting, bigger, stronger, and wetter every year. But but then it ends up getting used in different ways. So the legislature created this like essentially slush fund for the governor to use. And I remember this wasn't a one I wrote a lot about because I tend to focus on like, economic issues and business lobbying, that sort of thing. But I remember watching the debates on this, and like opponents of this legislation or skeptics were kind of like, what are the guardrails here? It's just like, can he just like create the like an emergency over anything? And no, 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 this is just about responding to hurricanes. This slush fund is in place. Not 6 months later is when he declares this still never-ending immigration state of emergency, and that's part of where he's pulling funds for this sort of thing. So I think we've seen price tags floating out there that we're going to end up ultimately spending $450 million on Everglades, or yeah, Alligator Alcatraz, or I think I've seen people saying Gator Gitmo too, because I mean, man, there are just some people like cruelty as a form of pornography. They get off on this stuff, and it is like it is disturbing to see. But anyway, he is funding a lot of that out of this slush fund that the legislature created for him. Now the state has said that it will seek reimbursement from the federal government through FEMA on this, which is interesting in the sense that taxpayers are still paying for it. It's just a matter of if it's Florida taxpayers or federal taxpayers. But there is a lawsuit going, as I mentioned, to try and stop this thing down. And right now, the lawsuit is predicated on the federal government not following a lot of it, like following environmental rules, because the Everglades, one of the most ecologically sensitive places in the world, not necessarily the place you would want a 2 to 5,000 person concentration camp where planes coming and going. Well, we're taking people to supermax prisons in El Salvador or wherever we're sending folks. In this case, the suit partially argues that the federal government is not following its own sort of procedures to get this done. And one of the defenses the state and the feds are relying on is, well, no, the state is doing this. There's no guarantee that the feds are going to pay for this. Right now, it's just all state money. And again, they can only do this because Ron DeSantis has this slush fund the legislature gave him, and willingly gave him, and are now like turning a blind eye to, or reveling in the fact that they're getting spent on something that they can sort of like do, like again, torture porn stuff. But that's not all. The other thing about a state of emergency is the Florida legislature can end it at any time. This is one of the checks designed to prevent a governor from continuing a state of emergency on sort of in perpetuity, right? And claiming these powers for themselves and bypassing bidding processes and being able to commandeer land for forever. The legislature can end a state of emergency itself. And of course, they have not. We have spent so much time this year talking about the ways in which the Florida legislature has tried to reel in the governor on some of his other powers. But this is one they have refused to. So much of that, some of what they have done has been meaningful. Some of it has failed, which we'll get to in a bit. But they have absolutely turned a blind eye and consented to the governor abusing his emergency powers in the way he has. And the reward is they get to pose for a bunch of pictures like they're Hollywood celebrities, except they're doing it over, a concentration camp. It's the sort of thing that, like, when we look back 20, 30, 40, 50 years on this, I wonder how many of them will be proud of these photos they're taking. Now, this is all bringing me to sort of the other big story, and this relates to where the legislature did at least make an attempt to rein in the governor's powers. So, for my money, and I'll throw a link to this into the show notes, but I wrote after sort of the regular part of session ended, before we went into sort of our perpetual budget abyss. I wrote a piece about the best piece of legislation, the best and worst bills that had passed. And the best bill that passed this year was House Bill 1445, and I'll also link to that, the actual legislation in the show notes. And this was a bill that would have substantially strengthened the state's anti-corruption laws. And more to the point, it was born out of Ron DeSantis' abuses of powers during the last election. And we have obviously talked a lot on this podcast and written a lot in the newsletter about the ways the governor, the unprecedented ways in which the governor used his office and had his appointees use their official powers to interfere with last year's constitutional amendment campaigns. There were two citizen-led constitutional amendments on the ballot in Florida last year. Amendment 3 that would have legalized marijuana, and Amendment 4 that would have prohibited government interference with abortion access and overturned the state's near total abortion ban. Both of those were enormously popular with voters. They both got, despite all the state's efforts, which included spending at least $20 million in taxpayer money on political ads opposing this. It included laundering money from a Medicaid settlement through the governor's Hope Florida Foundation and turning that into anti marijuana ads. It included doing favors for donors like the hemp industry and Philip Morris in exchange for campaign contributions that helped pay for even more of these ads. It included sicking election police on people who signed these petitions, sending cops to the doors of voters who signed Amendment 4 petitions to interrogate them about whether they'd actually signed, whether that was their signature. It even included threatening to criminally investigate and prosecute television stations that aired ads in support of Amendment 4. I mean, this stuff was beyond the pale. And so House Bill 1445 kind of arose out of that. So there were some, to explain it just a little bit more, there were some lawsuits filed during last year's elections accusing the governor and some of his senior most aides, like the political appointee he has over an entity known as the Agency for Healthcare Administration, which is the agency that spearheaded a lot of the work against Amendment 4, the state interference against Amendment 4. And in these lawsuits accused the governor and his appointees of breaking a law known as it's known as the Little Hatch Act, and it's a reference to there's a federal Hatch Act that is meant to sort of restrict the political activities of government employees and government leaders, essentially to prevent people entrusted in positions of public power from abusing that power to interfere with elections. And in these lawsuits, lawyers for the state, for the governor and his administration, argued that the governor and his senior most political appointees were exempt from this law, that they were free to interfere with elections if they wanted to. Essentially, they argued, legally speaking, that they were above the law. And they relied on some language in the Little Hatch Act, some hazy language. Let's say it that way. It did not say what they said it say, but I will agree that it was somewhat confusing as to what this language was originally intended to accomplish. And so House Bill 1445 would have just wiped that confusing language out of the way. It would have made no doubt that the governor is subject to the Little Hatch Act, that the governor cannot use his office to interfere within elections. That is not all. It would have expanded the Little Hatch Act to make sure it also applies to ballot campaigns, not just campaigns for elected office. And so it would have prevented him and his aides from interfering in state and future constitutional amendment campaigns. It would have also expanded there are prohibitions on like what kind of political activities state employees can engage in during while on duty. It would have expanded that to prohibit them from like essentially soliciting from donations from lobbyists while on duty and stuff like that. This has been an enormous problem in the DeSantis administration where they've been caught repeatedly, senior aides to the government caught repeatedly squeezing lobbyists, using the threats of budget vetoes hanging over them, squeezing them for donations to his presidential campaign, to the Casey DeSantis's like commitments to a Casey DeSantis presidential campaign, squeezing lobbyists not to give to like Byron Donalds, the Trump-backed Republican who's running for governor in 2026. There's like a long history of this. It's all I'll dig up a couple of stories and throw those into the show notes as well. So the House Bill 1445 would have closed some of the avenues there. Still not all. There was a bunch more in there. I'll just mention one other. It would have required the political appointees the governor chooses to run Florida's public universities and colleges, and the Board of Governors, which is the overarching board that oversees the university system. It would have required those appointees to be either residents of Florida or alumni of the universities that they were overseeing. And so this was designed to prevent situations like we've seen in New College, where the governor can just drop a slate of national like ideologues, like a Christopher Rufos of the world, people living in New York or Seattle or Washington, and dropping them onto Florida universities with instructions to like essentially commandeer those places and turn them into partisan instruments of the state. That would have made that a more challenging thing. So that would have created a check on the governor's power to control state universities solely by like making them actually find Floridians or alumni, people who have clear reason to care about the state or its schools, and don't just treat them like, ideological experiments or exercises in like raw political power. House Bill 1445 passed overwhelmingly. It passed the House by 97 to 1 vote. The one vote was a Republican from Palm Beach County, a guy by the name of Mike Caruso, who's been one of the only like DeSantis like complete toadies in the legislature. Just does whatever Ron DeSantis wants. He is about to get appointed to an office. He's going to get rewarded for his blind loyalty to the governor. So he's the only guy that voted against the bill. In the Senate, it passed 37-0. So you're talking about a bill that passed virtually unanimously, just one vote against, and the governor vetoed it. It's been sitting on his desk, by the way, for almost 2 weeks, and he's been waiting to do something, and he waited until the grand opening of Alligator Alcatraz. So the president, Donald Trump, flew in for a big media appearance there. This was like an international attention story, and so he waited until this day to veto this anti-corruption bill. And that is intentional. He knew there would be so much attention on Alligator Alcatraz and all of just both the sort of the torture porn gleeful coverage in like right wing media to like sort of genuinely outraged coverage in normal media, folks like understanding that like a 2 week building a prison in 2 weeks in the middle of a swamp in hurricane season at a time when we're seeing civil rights violated across the country in this sort of mass immigration enforcement effort, people raising legitimate concerns about that. He knew everybody would have their attention on this, and he used that time to like turn around and tank this anti-corruption bill. And this is a situation where, in this case, like I said, the legislature actually made an effort to reel him in on this one, and they deserve some credit. Florida lawmakers in Tallahassee, and I'm speaking here particularly of Republican legislators in Tallahassee, because they've got super majorities in both chambers of the legislature. This bill does not happen without them. They deserve credit for passing the bill, but that's not enough. The governor has now vetoed this thing. It can be overturned. All it takes is a 2/3 vote. So 80 votes in the House. You give me 40-member Senate. I think it's 27 if you got a full Senate. 27, I believe, is the number in the Senate. Regardless, 37-0 in the Senate and 97-1 in the House. They've got the margins, and they've got them by a ton. They could overturn this veto if they wanted. I don't think they're going to. I think the Florida Senate particularly has decided to get into bed with Ron DeSantis. You saw this in the way the Senate utterly sucked up to the governor during the final stages of the budget, using a bunch of its own money, leadership money, to give the governor a bunch of stuff he wanted, all in hopes that he would leave all the spending, particularly for Senate President Ben Albritton and some of his district spending, that the governor would leave that alone. I think you're going to see the legislature take a dive on this now, and that would be, not only would it be the wrong thing to do, I think all of us should want stronger anti-corruption laws. I think I'm not even aware of like good faith Republicans sort of who agree with the ability of government officials to interfere with elections. There are plenty of people that were happy Amendment 4 and Amendment 3 failed to pass, but even those folks don't think that politicians that have access to public power should be interfering and dictating the results of elections. Like there was a reason this was such an overwhelmingly bipartisan bill. And so it should be overturned. This should be overturned. And if they refuse to do it, then they'd lose all the credit for passing it in the first place. Because this is where you actually have to do something hard. You have to challenge your governor in a way that you are on the right side of the issue. You've already done the hard work, and he's tanking this solely to preserve his own power to abuse the law. And if they don't, sort of just like they've turned a blind eye to a nearly 3-year-long state of emergency that's now being used to build a concentration camp on seized land, they become complicit in the next time a governor interferes in an election. The next time the governor's chief of staff calls up a bunch of lobbyists and like pressures them into giving money to Casey DeSantis or whatever it is, or whoever the next governor is, that's on the Florida legislature's hands too. So we'll see. I am obviously not super optimistic that a veto override is in the cards, even though the numbers are there for the reasons I just said. But I've been surprised before, and I will happily apologize if the legislature, particularly the Florida Senate, finds a spine here and actually stands up for like good governance on this. Because again, they passed this bill in the first place. This was a good bill to pass. Stand by it now. And just one other thing while I'm thinking of it, this is like Ron DeSantis has been, I've covered Jeb Bush, Charlie Crist, Rick Scott, and Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis has, with this veto, has cinched himself as like the worst governor for ethics in, at least in my time. And so I'm thinking here, just last year, I think it was last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, the legislature passed a really bad ethics bill, essentially gutting ethics investigations in the state. You might remember this was a bill that required ethics investigations to be based on personal knowledge rather than on potential hearsay. Like, so for instance, a newspaper does an investigation into something, you read that, you would no longer you can no longer file an ethics complaint, or you can file an ethics complaint, but the ethics investigators can't do anything with it because they gutted the enforcement of this. They required personal knowledge. Not only that, they also sabotaged all sorts of local ethics agencies around the state. In one case, particularly around, there are agencies that can launch their own investigations. This has been a big thing in Miami. We've seen this happen. The legislature passed a law preempting local ethics agencies from launching their own investigations. You can now, and also banning anonymous complaints. Can't accept anonymous complaints. Can't launch your own investigation. You can't act on any complaint that's not other than ones based on personal knowledge. It was altogether just like crippling ethics enforcement. And we've already seen the state's ethics commission go back and start tossing cases where they had already found probable cause that a violation of ethics law in Florida had existed. A politician had broken anti-corruption laws, throwing those cases out now because of the changes the legislature made here. That was a bill Ron DeSantis could have vetoed. It would have been an easy one to veto. It would have been one he could have won a lot of like, genuine plaudits for standing up to a legislature on that. He signed that into law. So he signs bills that weaken the state's ethics laws, and he vetoes bills that strengthen them. This is the governor we have in Florida, and he's got more power than any governor has ever had before him in this state. That's where we're living on. The one last place, perhaps the biggest power the governor has, and that all governors have, is line item vetoes. This is where you get to, rather than when the legislature passes a budget, you can go in and strike individual spending items. And we're going to go through all of that again, but I think I've probably talked long enough for this podcast. So we'll do another one pretty soon, going through a little bit more detail about what Ron DeSantis chose to veto, and more importantly, what he chose to let stand, because I think that sort of belies some of the rhetoric you'll hear out of him sometimes. So anyway, we'll be back again soon with a more detailed budget podcast. But otherwise, we'll leave it there. As always, just make sure to like and subscribe and leave a review if you can. Those are really helpful. And then if you haven't already, think about signing up for a subscription to the newsletter. Easiest place to find us is seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free. Nothing is behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you have the means. If that's something you've got the means for, we do ask that you do it. It's the money we raise from voluntary paid subscriptions are incredibly important to helping pay for reporting expenses like the costs of public records requests. Okay, we'll leave it there, and we will talk again very soon. Take care.